On the night, Prohibition finally died in New York. The men who had spent 13 years breaking the law were handed the keys to the liquor business by the very politicians who claimed to be cleaning it up. On April 7, 1933, outside the Empire State Building on Fifth Avenue in Manhattan, former New York Governor Al Smith stood on the sidewalk and accepted a case of legal beer from a delivery truck belonging to Jacob Ruppert's Brewery in Yorkville, the first legal beer delivery in New York City in 13 years, and a photograph that ran in newspapers across the country. But the true price of that legal beer, and of the full national repeal that followed 8 months later, was a bargain struck quietly in Albany's Capitol corridors and inside Tammany Hall's clubhouses on 14th Street, an arrangement that let the same bootleggers, ward bosses and corrupted police captains who had grown rich off Prohibition simply change their letterhead and keep running New York's liquor trade for another generation. How that happened, who profited, and who paid the real cost, is a story the champagne toasts of December 1933 never told. To understand the deal, you have to understand what 13 years of Prohibition had actually built in New York. When the Volstead Act took effect at midnight on January 17, 1920, New York City did not go dry. It went underground, and it went underground almost instantly. Within months, so-called speakeasies were opening in basements and back rooms across Manhattan. The 21 Club on West 52nd Street, run by cousins Jack Creendler and Charlie Burns, built a hidden wine cellar behind a brick wall that tourists can still see today. Chumley's, tucked into Bedford Street in Greenwich Village, kept 2 unmarked exits so patrons could vanish through either Barrow Street or a courtyard if police raided the front door. Estimates from the era, compiled by New York City police officials and later cited by historians, put the number of speakeasies in Manhattan alone somewhere between 20,000 and 100,000 by the late 1920s, more watering holes, by most counts, than the number of legal saloons the city had before Prohibition began. The law had not eliminated drinking. It had simply criminalized it, and in doing so it had created one of the most lucrative black markets New York had ever seen. That market needed supply, and New York's geography made it perfectly positioned to provide it. Off the coast of Long Island, technically New York State, not New York City, though the two are often blurred in the popular memory of this era, a flotilla of ships anchored just beyond the 3-mile limit of American jurisdiction, a smuggling corridor, sailors called Rum Row. Cargo from these ships, often originating in the Bahamas or off the coast of Canada, was run ashore in speedboats along the beaches of Nassau and Suffolk counties, then trucked into the 5 boroughs. Within the city itself, smuggling routes fed through the working waterfronts of Brooklyn and Staten Island, where longshoremen and small-time operators supplemented meager Depression-era wages by looking the other way, or by loading crates themselves. Meanwhile, in neighborhoods like East Harlem, Greenwich Village's Little Italy Pocket, and the Italian enclaves of Brooklyn's South Williamsburg and Bensonhurst, families exploited a loophole in the Volstead Act itself. It permitted home production of up to 200 gallons per year of non-intoxicating cider and fruit juice for personal use. And Italian-American households used it to keep making wine, sometimes in staggering quantities, filling basements with barrels that technically towed a legal line while in practice supplying entire blocks. The money generated by all of this was almost impossible to overstate. New York's bootlegging economy created its own aristocracy, men like Arnold Rothstein, the gambler and financier often credited by contemporaries and later historians as one of the first to organize bootlegging into a structured business rather than a series of amateur smuggling runs, before his unsolved murder at the Park Central Hotel on West 56th Street in November 1928. There was Owney Madden, an English-born gangster who ran the Phoenix Cereal Beverage Company as a front and controlled the Cotton Club in Harlem at 142nd Street and Lenox Avenue, a club that showcased black performers like Duke Ellington and Cab Calloway to an audience that, until 1928, was almost exclusively white, under a policy that reflected the era's brutal racial double standard even within the criminal underworld. There was Irving Wexler, better known as Waxy Gordon, who built a bootlegging network across the metropolitan area before federal prosecutor Thomas E. Dewey secured his conviction for income tax evasion in 1933, the same legal strategy that had already taken down Al Capone in Chicago. There was Dutch Schultz, who controlled bootlegging and the numbers racket in the Bronx and Harlem before his murder in a Newark chop house in October 1935, and rising beneath and around them, younger men who would matter enormously to what came after repeal, Frank Costello and Charles Lucky Luciano, both of whom used Prohibition-era liquor profits and organizational experience to build the framework of what would later be called organized crime in New York, a framework that did not disappear when the liquor became legal again. It simply migrated into new licensed forms. None of this could have operated at the scale it did without institutional cover, and in New York that cover had a name: Tammany Hall. The Democratic political machine headquartered at 100 East 14th Street had, by the late 1920s, become deeply enmeshed with the bootlegging economy it was supposed to help police. Precinct captains and magistrates took payoffs to protect speakeasies from raids. Police officers on the beat expected and received regular cash tribute simply to look away. The extent of this corruption became a matter of formal public record through the investigations led by Judge Samuel Seabury, appointed in 1930 to examine New York City's magistrates' courts and, later, the conduct of the city's own government under a joint legislative committee. Seabury's investigation, which ran from 1930 into 1932, produced testimony revealing systemic bribery running through the police department and the courts, implicating officials at nearly every level. It was Seabury's inquiry that exposed financial irregularities surrounding Mayor James J. Walker, Bo James, the dapper, nightclub-loving mayor who had governed the city since 1926, including undisclosed accounts and gifts from businessmen seeking favors. Facing removal by Governor Franklin D. Roosevelt, Walker resigned on September 1, 1932, and left for Europe rather than face the hearing's conclusion. It was one of the first cracks showing that the entire structure Prohibition had built, profitable, protected, and politically entangled, was becoming impossible to sustain. But the corruption was only half the story, and arguably the less lethal half. The other half played out in the city's morgues, and it fell to two men to document it: Dr. Charles Norris, New York City's chief medical examiner, and his chief toxicologist, Dr. Alexander Gettler, working out of the Bellevue Hospital complex on Manhattan's East Side. Federal law required industrial alcohol, the kind used in manufacturing, not drinking, to be denatured with poisonous additives specifically to discourage bootleggers from diverting it into liquor. Bootleggers diverted it anyway, and then attempted crude repurification, and the results killed people, often the poorest New Yorkers who could not afford genuine imported liquor and instead drank whatever cut-rate rotgut circulated through their neighborhoods. Norris turned the city's death statistics into a public indictment of federal policy itself, releasing reports and giving interviews, arguing that Washington was, in effect, poisoning its own citizens to enforce an unenforceable law. His numbers were public and devastating. In the early 1930s, New York City alone recorded several hundred deaths annually attributable to poisoned or adulterated liquor, spread across all 5 boroughs but landing hardest on the working class and immigrant communities that had the least access to reliable, expensive smuggled goods. Norris kept making his case in public for years, and it worked its way into the growing national argument that Prohibition wasn't simply unpopular. It was, in a very literal sense, killing New Yorkers by policy design. By 1932, then, New York stood at the center of two overlapping crises: a criminal political economy so entangled that a sitting mayor had just been forced from office over it, and a public health emergency traceable directly to federal enforcement methods. Into this moment stepped a man who understood exactly how dangerous and how useful the Prohibition question had become: Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who had succeeded Al Smith as governor of New York State in Albany in 1929 and was now maneuvering toward the presidency. Roosevelt, notably, had spent years being cautious and vague on the liquor question, aware that the Democratic Party was split between the wet strongholds of northeastern cities like New York and the dry, rural South and Midwest. But by the time of the 1932 Democratic National Convention in Chicago, the political ground had shifted decisively. The party's platform committed to outright repeal of the 18th Amendment, and Roosevelt, sensing the wind, embraced it. He would go on to win the presidency in November 1932 by a landslide, and among the many mandates voters seemed to hand him, ending Prohibition was one of the clearest. It's worth pausing on who else was pushing that agenda, because this is where the money behind repeal comes into focus, and it did not come from bootleggers at all, at least not directly. John D. Rockefeller Jr., a lifelong teetotaler who personally despised alcohol, had become one of the largest financial backers of the Association Against the Prohibition Amendment, a repeal advocacy organization, because he had concluded that Prohibition was doing more damage to American law, institutions, and respect for government than alcohol itself ever had. In 1933, Rockefeller commissioned and funded a report titled Toward Liquor Control, authored by Raymond Fosdick and Albert Scott, which laid out a detailed blueprint for how states should regulate liquor after repeal, not through a free market, but through tightly licensed distribution systems, state control boards, and restrictions designed explicitly to prevent the kind of saloon culture and criminal infiltration that had defined the pre-Prohibition and Prohibition eras alike. New York State would adopt almost exactly this model. And that decision to hand liquor regulation to a state licensing bureaucracy, rather than simply legalizing sales, is precisely where the dirty deal would take root, because licenses in the hands of political machines have always been just another word for patronage. The unwinding happened in stages, and New York moved fast at nearly every one of them. Congress passed the Cullen-Harrison Act in March 1933, amending the Volstead Act to legalize beer and wine up to 3.2% alcohol by weight, and Roosevelt signed it on March 22. The effective date was set for April 7th, the night New Yorkers would come to call New Beer's Eve. In Brooklyn, breweries that had spent 13 years surviving on near beer and in some cases ice cream or soda production as legal cover, Rheingold in Bushwick, Trommer's in East New York, Schaefer and Peel's, rushed to prepare real beer for legal sale again. Trucks lined up outside Jacob Rupert's brewery on Manhattan's East 92nd Street in Yorkville before dawn on April 7th, and when midnight struck, whistles and horns sounded across the city as the first legal beer in over a decade rolled out onto the streets. Crowds gathered outside breweries and taverns. Some estimates from contemporary press accounts suggested New Yorkers consumed over 1 million glasses of legal beer within the first day. It was in the midst of that celebration, hours later that same morning, that Al Smith accepted his now famous case of Rupert beer outside the Empire State Building, a building he served as president of, having lost the White House to Roosevelt's Democratic ticket back in 1928, and now presiding, fittingly, over the symbolic return of legal drink to the city he had governed. Full repeal of the 18th Amendment required ratifying a 21st Amendment, and it moved through the states with startling speed once Congress proposed it in February 1933. Rather than use state legislatures, which many dry politicians still controlled or feared, the amendment specified ratification by state conventions, a deliberate structural choice meant to put the question directly before voters rather than incumbent officeholders. New York held its ratifying convention in Albany, at the state capitol, and moved quickly to become one of the earliest states to approve repeal. Its delegates elected on a wave of public sentiment that had been building for years. By December 5, 1933, enough states, Utah providing the decisive 36th ratification that afternoon, had approved the amendment to make repeal the law of the land. In New York City that night, celebrations broke out across the boroughs, at the Hotel Astor on Times Square, at nightclubs in Harlem and Greenwich Village, and in the German beer halls of Yorkville that had waited 13 years for this moment. Prohibition as a national experiment was over, but national repeal only removed the federal prohibition. It did not create the rules for how liquor would actually be sold, distributed, and taxed within New York State, and that vacuum is where the real deal-making began, not in a single dramatic room, but across months of legislative horse trading in Albany between competing factions who all had something to protect. Governor Herbert Lehman, who had succeeded Roosevelt in Albany in 1933 as Roosevelt moved to the White House, pushed for a state alcoholic beverage control law that would establish a licensing bureaucracy modeled closely on the Rockefeller-funded Toward Liquor Control blueprint. The law passed in April 1934, creating the New York State Liquor Authority, a 3-member board with sweeping power to grant, deny, and revoke every license required to manufacture, distribute, or sell alcohol anywhere in the state, from Manhattan's grandest hotel bars to the smallest tavern in the farthest reaches of upstate New York. Here is where the arrangement reveals its teeth. To chair this powerful new authority, Lehman appointed Edward P. Mulrooney, a former New York City Police Commissioner who had held that post under none other than Mayor Jimmy Walker from 1930 to 1931, presiding over a police department that Judge Seabury's own investigations had just finished exposing as riddled with Prohibition-era graft. The man now empowered to clean up New York's liquor trade had, only a few years earlier, commanded the very force that had been paid to protect it. Whether Mulrooney personally profited from that earlier corruption is not the point. The point is what his appointment signaled, that the new legal order would be built, quite literally, out of the personnel and instincts of the old illegal one. Reformers who had hoped repeal would sweep away the corrupted networks of prohibition found instead that those networks simply reorganized themselves around a new set of paperwork. The licensing system itself became the mechanism for laundering both money and power. Because New York required capital connections and often existing infrastructure, trucks, warehouses, distribution routes, relationships with retailers to obtain and operate under a liquor license profitably, the men best positioned to succeed legally were, overwhelmingly, the same men who had run the illegal trade for over a decade. Former bootleggers quietly became licensed wholesalers and distributors. Trucking routes that had once smuggled rum row cargo into the 5 boroughs under cover of darkness became daylight delivery routes for legitimate distributors, often run by the identical companies, sometimes under new corporate names with straw owners fronting for men whose criminal records would have disqualified them from holding a license outright. Teamsters locals tied to the beer and liquor trucking industry, particularly in Manhattan and Brooklyn, had already been infiltrated by organized crime figures during Prohibition as a means of controlling supply chains. That control did not evaporate with repeal. If anything, legal status made the union locals more valuable, because now they controlled labor for an above-board, tax-paying, growing industry instead of a fugitive one. Frank Costello, one of the era's most sophisticated organized crime figures, moved his liquor importing operations toward legitimate distribution in these years, laying groundwork for an influence over the New York liquor and hospitality trade that outlasted Prohibition by decades. Auntie Madden eventually retired from the Cotton Club and New York's underworld to Hot Springs, Arkansas, in the mid-1930s. But the club and networks he built in Harlem persisted under new management until financial pressures during the Depression and shifting entertainment tastes finally closed the original Cotton Club location in February 1936, with a brief Broadway area revival following before it, too, faded. Tammany Hall's political patronage machine found the licensing system almost tailor-made for its purposes, even as the organization's power was beginning a long, slow decline. Getting a liquor license in New York City in the mid-1930s frequently meant navigating local political clubhouses, currying favor with district leaders, and understanding implicitly, if not explicitly, that support for the right candidates and the right precinct organizations eased the path through the state liquor authority's local offices. This was precisely the kind of arrangement that reform-minded critics feared, and it arrived at almost the exact moment New York City itself seemed to be turning away from machine politics. Fiorello LaGuardia, a reform Republican fusion candidate who had campaigned explicitly against Tammany corruption exposed by the Seabury investigations, was inaugurated as mayor of New York City on January 1, 1934, just months before the state's new liquor law took effect. LaGuardia moved aggressively against organized crime's visible footholds in the city, famously smashing slot machines with a sledgehammer for newsreel cameras and cracking down on numbers rackets. But the state liquor authority answered to Albany, not City Hall. It sat outside LaGuardia's jurisdiction entirely, a structural reality that meant the city's most visible reform mayor in a generation had no direct authority over the single agency most responsible for policing New York's post-Prohibition liquor economy. The dirty deal, in other words, wasn't only about who got licenses. It was about which level of government would hold the power to grant them, and Albany's political establishment still shot through with machine influence, even as Tammany's city grip loosened, made sure that power stayed upstate, safely insulated from City Hall's reformist reach. The consequences of this arrangement rippled outward across New York for years. The state liquor authority became a recurring subject of scandal and legislative investigation through the late 1930s, 1940s, and into the 1950s, with periodic exposés alleging bribery in the granting of licenses, favoritism toward politically connected applicants, and continuing organized crime influence over nightclub and bar licensing in Manhattan's entertainment districts. The very nightlife culture that had made Prohibition-era New York legendary, the speakeasies of the 1920s birthing the supper clubs and cabarets of the 1930s and 1940s, often did so under licenses controlled, directly or through intermediaries, by men who had learned their trade running liquor past federal agents a decade earlier. The Stork Club on East 53rd Street, run by Sherman Billingsley, a former bootlegger himself, became one of the most fashionable night spots in America throughout the 1930s and 1940s. Its clientele, including movie stars, gossip columnists, and politicians, its existence a living monument to the seamlessness of the transition from illegal to legal New York nightlife. Brooklyn's brewing industry, meanwhile, enjoyed a genuine boom in the years immediately following repeal, with Rheingold, Trommers, Schaefer, and Peel's all expanding production to meet demand that had been suppressed for over a decade. That boom would not last forever, By the 1950s and 1960s, national brewing consolidation and changing consumption patterns would shutter most of Brooklyn's historic breweries one by one, Trommer's closing its Bushwick operations in 1950 and Rheingold eventually ceasing Brooklyn production in 1976. But in the immediate aftermath of repeal, the borough's beer industry stood as visible proof that legal, taxed alcohol production could indeed re-employ thousands of New Yorkers and generate real municipal and state revenue, exactly as repeal's advocates had promised. The human cost that Dr. Charles Norris had spent years documenting also began gradually to recede. Deaths from poisoned or adulterated liquor in New York City declined sharply once genuine, regulated alcohol became widely available again, offering grim retrospective confirmation of the argument Norris had made for years, that Prohibition's enforcement mechanism, not alcohol itself, had been responsible for a meaningful share of the era's deaths. Norris died in September 1935, less than 2 years after his central public argument had been effectively validated by the policy reversal he had spent so much energy advocating for. And yet the deeper promise of repeal, that ending Prohibition would starve organized crime of its most reliable revenue stream and restore honest governance to New York's political and law enforcement institutions, proved only partially true and in some respects proved false in ways that shaped the city for decades. Organized crime in New York did not collapse when liquor became legal again. It diversified. The organizational skills, capital reserves, labor union footholds, and political relationships built during 13 years of bootlegging became the foundation for continued involvement in gambling, loan sharking, labor racketeering on the docks of Brooklyn, Manhattan, and Staten Island, and eventually narcotics trafficking. Lucky Luciano, convicted of compulsory prostitution charges in 1936 by Special Prosecutor Thomas Dewey, the same Dewey who had earlier convicted Waxy Gordon on tax charges, was sentenced to 30 to 50 years in state prison, a fall from power for one of the era's central bootlegging-era figures, though later commuted and deported after his wartime cooperation with naval intelligence during World War II, a controversial episode debated by historians ever since. Frank Costello, by contrast, largely avoided serious criminal conviction through the late 1930s and 1940s and became one of the most politically influential organized crime figures in New York, maintaining relationships with judges, police officials, and Tammany-connected politicians well into the 1950s. When the televised Kefauver Committee hearings on organized crime finally exposed the extent of his reach to a national audience in 1951, his hands famously the only part of him shown on camera, as he refused to display his face during testimony. Looking back across the whole arc of it, from the first speakeasies opening within months of the Volstead Act in 1920, through Seabury's investigations and Walker's forced resignation in 1932, through Al Smith's beer delivery at the Empire State Building and the champagne toasts of December 1933, to the quiet Albany deal-making that created the State Liquor Authority in 1934 under a former police commissioner from the most corrupted era of the department's history. The story of Prohibition's end in New York resists the simple redemption arc so often applied to it. The popular memory wants repeal to be the moment New York cleaned itself up, closed the chapter on gangsters and speakeasies, and returned to lawful, orderly civic life. The documented history tells something more complicated and in its way more honest about how power actually moves in this city. Prohibition did not create corruption in New York's politics, policing, and business world. It simply gave corruption a spectacularly profitable new industry to attach itself to, and when that industry became legal again, the arrangement barely had to change its name. The bootleggers became distributors, the corrupted police commissioner became the liquor regulator. The political machine that profited from protection payoffs found the licensing bureaucracy every bit as useful as the badge had been. Tammany Hall's grip on the city was fading by the mid-1930s, worn down by Seabury's exposures and LaGuardia's reformist energy, but the habits of patronage, favor trading, and quiet accommodation between government and organized money that Tammany had perfected did not disappear with it. They migrated into new institutions, the way water finds a new channel when the old one is dammed. What makes this New York story specifically rather than simply America's is the density and proximity of everything involved. The 5 boroughs packed with speakeasies and breweries and waterfront smuggling routes, The state capital in Albany just close enough to make the deal-making practical, but just far enough to insulate it from city reformers. The newspapers and courtrooms of Manhattan broadcasting the scandal and the celebration in the same decade, the morgues of Bellevue quietly keeping score of the human cost, while the nightclubs of Harlem and the beer gardens of Yorkville celebrated its end. New York didn't just experience prohibition and repeal as policy. It lived them as neighborhood-level, block-by-block reality, in ways that shaped how the city's politics, labor unions, nightlife, and law enforcement would operate for the rest of the 20th century. The dirty deal that ended prohibition in New York wasn't a single signature on a single document. It was a slow, distributed accommodation among people who understood that laws change far more easily than power does, and that the surest way to survive a legal revolution is to make certain you're still standing, with your hands on the same levers, when the new rules finally take effect. That, more than any champagne toast on Times Square, is the story December 5, 1933, actually tells about New York, if you know where to look for it.